Yeah, please go ahead, Professor.
Okay, thank you very much. Nobody wanted to be politically on the right. I'll give you, I think, a much more traditional conservative perspective on this. Like you just said, nobody here is a lawyer other than our chair. For those who are old enough, I'm not a lawyer either, but I stayed at a Holiday Express once. You know, remember that commercial? I was trained a little bit in international law, but again, I'm not a lawyer. So what I wanted to look at is the drones, US foreign policy, and international law, sort of this complex. In particular, when it comes to international law, the methodology is fairly basic, meaning you don't have a hypothesis or any grand point. You just basically try to figure out what the law is as best as you can. So I wanted to do this now, not per se focusing on the US, but since the US is a state that is using that technology very heavily, it almost comes with the topic itself. I'm also basically sticking with a very short historical perspective and then trying to evaluate the US government's position on this. That's it. I'm not making or implying or not implying any moral judgments, etc., etc. I'm using up my hands now.
It's funny because it didn't happen during the
Probably technology.
Probably because people are going in and out.
Go ahead, Professor, let me go ask.
Now, the other thing that I wanted to do, and in the interest of time and not making this too boring, in the paper I split this up in two. I'm basically saying, well, drones do two things. Number one, surveillance, and this is sort of where they started, and they've been armed quite recently. So I wanted to look first at the surveillance part. And there the law is as straightforward as it can, meaning surveillance if you fly into another country's airspace. Again, this is intrusion. There are a couple of treaties out there that clearly forbid this. The US Air Force has a policy that they call no free rides over the United States, so as rigorous as it can be. Now, the one legal distinction that is being made, civilian aircrafts, Delta Airlines, etc., governmental aircraft, there's a clear and absolute, a state would have to ask for permission before it can enter foreign airspace. I'm pointing this out because when I looked a little bit around for historical analogies, I found it sort of intriguing that during the Cold War, there seems to be somewhat of a, that's my guess, or my somewhat informed guess, gentleman's agreement that you wouldn't completely reject or work against, in particular, the U-2 spy planes. A couple of them were shot down, but when I looked at the data on this, I was wondering how much, particularly the Soviet Union, could have shot down if they really had wanted to. And the point that I want to aim at is the surveillance seems to be the less controversial part, clearly, and something maybe that has advantages that even the victim states, the state whose airspace is violated, could see. There are a couple of quotes, I'm not going to bother you with this, particularly from the Pakistani side, where they, even in their official announcement, seem to indicate that, yeah, okay, it's the killing part basically in 2001 the United States then began to arm these drones. And this is clearly where the all the controversy comes into play. Nonetheless, since I'm trying to make this point towards the end, maybe, just maybe, there might be wisdom, not necessarily military advantage, but wisdom in separating drones and say, well, these are just surveillance drones. This is just espionage. Maybe that's at least to some extent making this acceptable for espionage. In Germany, there's a discussion about this right now. Should Germany get drones? And German Air Force has some, but not the ones that can shoot. Now, moving on to the drones that now also are used, primarily used for what the United States calls targeted killings. Legally, the critical distinction that the United States emphasizes and has to is that there's a state of war, and within the state of war, from the perspective of international law, different rules apply. In many ways, if you use missiles, shooting at targets using drones, if it was not a situation of war under international law, you would lose any legal ground because the weapon would just be considered disproportional. So that's the very first one. I'll come back to this again and again and again. The most important thing, and you hear this if you look for the keywords repeatedly from the US government, is we are in a state of war. We are in a state of war since 9/11/2001. If that were not the case, in my opinion, the legal house of cards would come down almost immediately. Now, even if if you are in a, legally speaking, in a state of war, a couple of things. I'm trying to make this as short and painless as I can. Again, even there, under the legal regime of state of war, and then it's called international humanitarian law, the rules that apply during the time of war. The usage of violence has to be militarily necessary. And one can argue back and forth to what extent and which missions by drones are militarily necessary.
Keep going, I guess.
Then, if you are in a situation of war, in a state of war, killing is very unfortunate but legal. And I'll make a very brief footnote here. I live in South Korea, in Seoul. That's about, 40 kilometers away from North Korea. They have just announced that the armistice is not in force anymore. It's illegal, but nonetheless. Canceled a couple of other security arrangements, cut the phone lines, the direct phone lines, and stated that they are in a state of war. That makes me a little bit more nervous than usual, right? Because there is a claim that the legal situation has changed. The other thing that is quite controversial in the legal discourses is, well, is this still a war? How can that be? What is an armed conflict? Again, legally speaking. And there's been a fairly recent investigation, and they came up with a conclusion. It was somewhat different in the past, but as of today, international law would require that there is significant, one of these formulations that need interpretation, violence, fighting with some intensity, and at least two organized groups. So again, by that standard, you could argue that most likely Al-Qaeda is still organized enough. Another problem really is, from a legal perspective, if one assumes that an armed conflict started in 2001, if one agrees with that assumption, did it maybe already end? If the enemy was Al-Qaeda, or by extension the Taliban, by resisting the demands of the United States at the time, then at the latest, when the Taliban was defeated, that would then clearly end the war. Or at the very, very latest, when you have a new government in Afghanistan. There is another issue in terms of the battlefield. In a war, you need a battlefield under the legal concept. And people have said, well, the battlefield, well, most common sense would suggest it was initially Afghanistan. How can it now be Yemen in addition to northern Pakistan? Most lawyers would suggest that that is actually not such a rigorous requirement, in the sense that this type of war that started in 2001 is not the traditional form where you mass your militaries and find an open space and then say, okay, tomorrow we will have battle. There's also the requirement of proportionality, and there when it becomes quite tricky with the, in particular, the current policy on the drone strikes, because of the apparent need for secrecy. We really don't know. I mean, people like me, simple, not in the White House or so, know how much damage actually is done, and therefore you cannot make the judgment whether the quote-unquote military necessity and the principle of proportionality, whether that squares. In terms of technology, the argument is made that, well, we are getting more precise, limiting, again, to use that military terminology, collateral damage. But again, without more data, this is almost impossible to. It's impossible to make a informed decision on this. I'm coming to what I consider a little bit more the more intriguing parts of this. I think if one assumes that a state of war exists, the legal requirements the United States most likely can defend its position, legally speaking. Logically and legally, war has to have a purpose. It's not under the legal concept, it's an exception. We have peace, and in certain situations, for example, self-defense, war is allowed. But it has to have a purpose. Politics ultimately must be in charge of that time period too. And I have a couple of quotes in here that I found that for me begin to indicate that what is the purpose of right now. Very often then I found notions of, well, we are constantly disrupting Al-Qaeda and distracting them. So that is not, traditionally speaking, that is not a purpose of the war. You're not constantly trying to disrupt somebody. You're trying to start a war, end a war when that purpose is, and then be done with it. So that's one area where I'm wondering, what is the purpose of the current quote-unquote war on terror? We could have a very interesting discussion on this, on self-defense, because that is the most important assumption or starting point, legal starting point that the US government has been making. We were attacked, and now under Article 51 of the UN Charter, we are legitimized to conduct a war in self-defense. The counter-argument that has been made is, again, time. I mean, at some point, logically, one would argue, you lose that connection if you just keep fighting and fighting and fighting. And I think it also relates to the point that I just made, what is the political purpose? When it comes to self-defense too, the argument very often, when I look at some quotes, starts with this, and then the argument goes, and we are still defending. What are we doing? Well, we are distracting, we're disrupting, and coming to a conclusion, this is actually where I see more of a problem. When I look at this, starting from the legal perspective, the technical legal requirements, there is disagreement, and in my opinion, the United States could probably defend its position. I'm wondering, time and purpose, how could one make this argument if the intention just simply is to disrupt operations? At what point would that political purpose be achieved? And in some ways, then you begin to argue not about fighting a war, not even preemption. Then you begin that discussion again of prevention, of using military force to prevent something from happening before it is materialized, before it has materialized. And that is clearly illegal under international law, and I hope I haven't overused my 2 minutes. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Yeah, great. I'm sure we'll have a chance to do that.